I was driving back from my cousin's wedding in the middle of nowhere, some godforsaken stretch of highway in rural Oklahoma. The kind of road that feels like it could go on forever, flanked by endless fields of nothing but shadow. It was late, probably close to midnight, and my eyelids were heavy, the faint hum of my old pickup lulling me into a dangerous sort of calm. Then the gas light flicked on. I cursed under my breath. There hadn't been a gas station for miles, and my phone's battery was dead, leaving me completely reliant on whatever might come up next. It felt like hours before I finally spotted the faint glow of a neon sign cutting through the blackness. Gas and goods, the sign read, half the letters flickering like a dying bulb. The place looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 70s. Peeling paint, a rusting metal roof, and a single pump with a cracked screen. But beggars can't be choosers, right? I pulled up, relieved to see the dim light inside the station still on. I parked by the pump and walked inside to pay, but as soon as I stepped through the door, something felt off. The air was stale, carrying a faint metallic scent I couldn't place. The aisles were lined with dusty shelves, holding everything from expired snack cakes to motor oil. And then there was the cashier. He was an older guy, maybe in his late 60s, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of stone. His eyes, though, they were unsettling, cloudy, like he wasn't really seeing me, or like he was looking through me. He didn't greet me, just stood there behind the counter watching as I approached. "Pump one," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded slowly, his lips curling into the faintest semblance of a smile. "Long way from home, aren't ya?" he asked, his voice gravely and thick, like he'd been smoking since birth. "Yeah, just passing through," I replied, pulling out a 20 and sliding it across the counter. The man took the bill, his rough fingers lingering on mine just a little too long before he turned to ring me up. "Be careful out there," he muttered as he handed me my change. "These roads, they got a way of swallowing people up." I forced a laugh, brushing it off as small-town weirdness, and headed back to my truck. The pump was slow, creaking as it dispensed the gas, and I found myself glancing back at the station. The old man was still standing at the counter, staring at me through the glass. When the tank was finally full, I climbed back into the cab and started the engine. But as I pulled out onto the highway, I noticed something in the rearview mirror. There was a figure standing by the pump I'd just used. It wasn't the cashier. This person was tall, too tall, with limbs that seemed unnaturally long. Their face was obscured by the shadows, but I could feel their eyes on me, piercing through the darkness. My stomach dropped. I hit the gas, my heart pounding as I sped down the road. But the further I went, the stranger things became. The highway, which had been a straight shot for miles, seemed to twist and turn in ways I didn't remember. The trees lining the road grew denser, their branches arching overhead to form a tunnel that swallowed the moonlight. Then my headlights caught something up ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the pavement, and the truck skidded to a halt just feet away from the figure. It was the same person from the gas station. They were closer now, and I could see them more clearly. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their mouth was stretched into an impossibly wide grin, filled with teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. I threw the truck into reverse, but before I could move, the figure tilted its head and raised one hand, pointing back the way I'd come. "Nope," I muttered, gripping the steering wheel with trembling hands. I cranked the wheel and floored it, swerving around the figure and tearing down the road. My pulse was racing, my chest tight with fear, but I didn't dare look back. The road seemed endless, the trees pressing in closer and closer until it felt like I was driving through a tunnel of black. Then, without warning, the engine sputtered and died, leaving me coasting to a stop on the side of the road. I sat there in silence, gripping the wheel and trying to calm my breathing. But then I heard it, a faint tapping. It was coming from the passenger side window. I turned my head slowly, and my blood turned to ice. The figure was there, pressed against the glass, their grin wider than ever. They raised a hand and pointed again, this time at the woods. I locked the doors, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the key to restart the engine. But it wouldn't turn. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like the glass was going to shatter. Then I heard a voice. "Get out." It wasn't a whisper. It was a command, deep and resonant, reverberating through the cab like it was coming from everywhere at once. I don't know what possessed me to do it, maybe fear, maybe some primal instinct, but I opened the door and stepped out into the cold night air. The figure was gone, but the voice remained, beckoning me toward the trees. Come closer. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the dark wall of the forest. The voice grew louder, more urgent, pulling me deeper into the shadows until the gas station and the highway were nothing but distant memories. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the voice stopped. I was alone in the woods, surrounded by silence so heavy it pressed against my ears. I turned in circles, trying to find my way back, but every direction looked the same. That's when I saw the lights. They were faint, flickering in the distance like the glow of fireflies. I followed them, hoping they might lead me back to the road. But as I got closer, I realized they weren't lights at all. They were eyes. Dozens of them, glowing in the darkness, attached to figures just like the one from the gas station. They surrounded me, their grins splitting their faces as they closed in. I don't remember much after that. Just the sound of laughter, high-pitched and hollow, echoing all around me, and the feeling of hands grabbing at my arms, my legs, pulling me into the dark. When I woke up, it was morning, and I was lying in a ditch by the side of the highway. My truck was gone, my phone was gone, and the gas station, it wasn't there. I walked for miles before I found another station, this one bright and modern, with real people and functioning pumps. The clerk called the cops for me, but they didn't find anything. No truck, no station, no creepy old man. Sometimes I think it was a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But then I remember those eyes and the way they seemed to look straight through me, and I know it was real. I still don't drive at night anymore.
Story number 2.
It was late, probably close to 2 in the morning, and I was on my way back home after visiting my mom in a neighboring state. The highway was empty except for the occasional 18-wheeler roaring past, its headlights briefly illuminating the dark stretch of road ahead. I was exhausted, but determined to push through the last hour of my trip. That's when I saw the gas station. It seemed to appear out of nowhere, the flickering neon sign casting an eerie green glow over the cracked pavement. Thompson's Fuel and More, it read, though some of the letters were burnt out, leaving just though, fuel, and re. I didn't really need gas, but my stomach was growling, and I figured I could grab a snack and maybe stretch my legs. As I pulled in, I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed muted, swallowed up by the oppressive darkness pressing in from all sides. The first thing I noticed when I walked inside was the smell. It wasn't the usual mix of coffee and cleaning supplies you'd expect in a gas station. No, this was metallic, like rust or old blood. The cashier was an older woman with stringy gray hair and sunken eyes that barely acknowledged me as I stepped inside. She sat behind the counter, her bony hands clutching a mug of something steaming, though she didn't seem to be drinking it. Evening, I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice came out tight, almost shaky. She didn't respond, just stared at me, her lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I shrugged it off and made my way the aisle. The shelves were sparsely stocked, most of the items dusty or expired. I grabbed a bag of chips and a soda, but as I turned to head back to the counter, I felt it. A cold, prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I spun around, expecting to see someone behind me, but the aisle was empty. That's when I noticed the mirrors. They were scattered throughout the store, small and circular, positioned in corners and above the shelves. They weren't your typical convex security mirrors, though. These were old, their silver backing tarnished and cracked, making the reflections wavy and distorted. And in one of them, I saw movement. It was quick, just a flicker of shadow darting across the glass, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I turned again, scanning the aisles, but I was still alone. Need something? The cashier's voice cut through the silence, startling me. I glanced back at her. She was still sitting there, her bony fingers tapping rhythmically against the counter. Her eyes were locked on me now, sharp and unblinking. "No, I'm good," I muttered, heading toward the counter. But as I passed another mirror, I caught a glimpse of something else. This time, it was clear. A figure standing just behind me, tall and gaunt, with long, skeletal arms that reached almost to the floor. Its face was pale and featureless, except for 2 hollow black pits where its eyes should have been. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. Slowly, I turned around, but there was nothing there. "Everything okay?" the cashier asked, her voice dripping with something that almost sounded like amusement. "Yeah," I lied, forcing a smile as I placed my items on the counter. My hands were trembling. She rang me up without a word, her eyes never leaving mine. When she handed me the change, her fingers were ice cold, and I swear I saw something shift in her reflection in the window behind her. "Careful out there," she said as I turned to leave. "These roads can be tricky at night." Her words followed me out into the parking lot, where the air felt heavier, almost suffocating. I climbed into my car and locked the doors, my heart pounding as I started the engine. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced back at the gas station one last time. Through the large glass windows, I saw the cashier still sitting there, staring out at me. But she wasn't alone. The figure from the mirror was standing behind her now, its long arms draped over her shoulders like a grotesque shadow. And then, as if it could sense me watching, it tilted its head and grinned, a wide, unnatural smile that stretched far too long. I slammed on the gas, the tires screeching as I sped back onto the highway. But the nightmare wasn't over. A few miles down the road, my headlights caught something in the distance, a figure standing in the middle of the highway. I slowed down, my heart racing as I squinted to make out what it was. It was the same thing I'd seen in the mirrors. It stood motionless, its arms hanging limp at its sides, its eyeless face turned directly toward me. I swerved, narrowly avoiding it, but as I glanced in the rearview mirror, it was gone. Or at least I thought it was. Because then I heard it. A faint tapping coming from the back seat. I didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at me to keep my eyes on the road, to just keep driving. But I couldn't help myself. Slowly, I glanced in the rearview mirror. And there it was, sitting in the back seat, its head tilted and that awful grin stretched across its pale face. I screamed, my hands jerking the wheel, and the car veered off the road. I hit the brakes, the tires skidding as the car came to a stop in the dirt. When I looked again, the back seat was empty. I sat there for what felt like hours, my hands gripping the wheel, my chest heaving with every labored breath. The highway was silent, the gas station nowhere in sight, as if it had never been there to begin with. Eventually, I managed to gather myself and drive home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Even now, as I sit here telling you this, I can feel it. The weight of its eyes on me. Watching. Waiting.
Story number 3.
I was driving back from a work trip late at night, the kind of late where the world feels utterly still and abandoned. The stretch of road I was on was long and empty, and my gas gauge was inching dangerously close to E. I had passed the last town an hour ago and knew I couldn't make it to the next one without filling up. That's when I saw it. A gas station, its neon sign flickering weakly in the darkness. The name wasn't clear, some of the letters burnt out or covered in grime, but it didn't matter. I needed gas, and there weren't any other options. I pulled in and parked by one of the pumps. The station looked ancient, its paint peeling and windows fogged over with years of dirt. A single light buzzed above the entrance, casting a sickly yellow glow. I stepped out into the cold night air and swiped my card at the pump, but the screen flashed, "See attendant," in garbled text. Great. Just what I needed. I hesitated, glancing toward the building. Something about it felt off. The windows were dark, but I could see a faint light flickering inside, like an old TV stuck on static. Against my better judgment, I headed for the door. The bell above jingled weakly as I stepped in, and immediately I was hit with the smell. It was sour and pungent, like something had rotted in the walls. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and the temperature felt colder than it had been outside. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing unnaturally in the small space. At first, there was no response. The store was dimly lit, with rows of dusty shelves that looked like they hadn't been restocked in years. The flickering light I'd seen from outside came from an old TV mounted in the corner, its screen showing nothing but static. Then I saw him, the attendant. He was standing behind the counter, completely still. His back was to me, his shoulders hunched, and his head cocked at an odd angle. Excuse me," I said, stepping closer. "The pump's not working. Can you turn it on for me?" He didn't move. "Hello?" Still nothing. My unease was growing by the second. I stepped around to get a better look at him, and that's when I noticed his hands. They were gripping the counter so tightly that his knuckles had turned white, and his nails, long, yellowed, and jagged, were digging into the wood. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice shaking. Finally he moved, but it wasn't natural. His head twisted toward me in a sharp, jerking motion, and I froze when I saw his face. His eyes were wide and unblinking, his pupils so dilated they almost swallowed the whites. His mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, his teeth too sharp and too many. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped, his voice low and guttural. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. "I just need to fill up my car," I stammered. "I'll be gone in a minute." His grin widened, stretching his face inhumanly. "They don't like visitors." "What are you talking about?" I whispered, but before he could answer, the TV crackled loudly, the static turning into distorted whispers. I glanced at it, and my stomach dropped. The screen wasn't showing static anymore. Instead, it displayed the gas station, but from an overhead perspective, like security footage. And in the corner of the screen, I saw myself standing at the counter, except I wasn't alone. There was something behind me. I spun around, but the store was empty, or at least it looked empty. The whispers grew louder, and the lights began to flicker wildly. The attendant started laughing, a deep, guttural sound that sent chills racing down my spine. "They're here," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "They've been waiting for you." The shelves began to shake, items falling to the floor with loud crashes. I turned and ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard I pulled, it felt like something was holding it shut from the other side. A loud thud came from behind me, and I turned just in time to see one of the shelves topple over, revealing a dark figure crouched in the shadows. Its body was emaciated, its limbs impossibly long, and its eyes glowed with a pale, sickly light. It moved toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on broken strings. "Stay away!" I screamed, grabbing the closest thing I could, a rusted fire extinguisher, and swinging it wildly. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if amused, and then it lunged. I threw myself to the ground as it sailed over me, crashing into the door with a deafening bang. The impact shook the building, and the lights went out completely, plunging the store into darkness. I scrambled to my feet, my hands fumbling for anything to defend myself. The whispers were all around me now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from every direction. The figure was gone, but I could feel it, lurking in the shadows, watching me. And then I heard it. The sound of nails scraping against the floor, slow and deliberate. It was behind me. I ran, weaving through the aisles, the scraping sound growing louder and faster. I turned a corner and nearly slammed into the attendant, who was now standing in the middle of the aisle. His eyes were gone, replaced by hollow, black voids, and his grin was wider than ever. "Stay," he whispered, his voice echoing in my head. I shoved past him, running for the back of the store. There had to be another way out. I found a door marked "Employees Only" and threw it open, rushing inside. The room was small and cramped, filled with cleaning supplies and broken equipment. But there was a window, small and dirty, but big enough to crawl through. I didn't hesitate. I climbed onto a stack of boxes and pushed the window open, the cool night air hitting my face. I was halfway out when I felt something grab my ankle. I screamed, kicking wildly as the whispers turned into guttural growls. Whatever had me was strong, its grip like ice, but adrenaline took over and I managed to break free. I hit the ground outside hard, scraping my palms and knees, but I didn't stop. I ran to my car, jumped in, and sped off without looking back. As I drove, the gas station disappeared into the darkness, like it had never been there. But the nightmare wasn't over. A few miles down the road, my car sputtered and died. I glanced at the gas gauge. It was empty, even though I hadn't driven far enough to drain the tank. And then I saw it. In my rearview mirror, the glowing sign of the gas station appeared in the distance, closer than it should have been. And standing beneath it, in the flickering light, was the attendant. He raised a hand and waved, his grin still stretching impossibly wide.
Story number 4.
The road stretched endlessly ahead, dark and featureless, with only my headlights cutting through the oppressive night. I was driving home from visiting a friend who lived in the middle of nowhere. My GPS had sent me down this deserted highway, and I hadn't seen another car or building for miles. It was the kind of quiet that made you hyper-aware of every sound. Your breath, the hum of the engine, the occasional creak of your seat. When my gas light came on, my stomach sank. I hadn't passed a gas station in hours, and I didn't know how much farther I could go. Just as I started to panic, I saw it, a sign flickering in the distance. "Last stop gas," it read with a picture of a grinning cartoon gas pump. Beneath the sign was a small rundown gas station. Its lights were on, casting a faint glow over the cracked asphalt. It looked abandoned, but I didn't have a choice. I pulled in and parked beside one of the pumps. The station was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant chirp of crickets. The place looked ancient, with peeling paint, a rusted roof, and a broken vending machine leaning against the wall. A single bulb hung above the entrance, swaying slightly in the breeze. I stepped out of my car and walked to the pump. There was no card reader, just an old-fashioned lever and a keypad covered in grime. I picked up the nozzle and pressed the lever, but nothing happened. "Of course," I muttered. The small store attached to the station looked empty, but I could see a faint light inside. I decided to try my luck and headed for the door. The bell above jingled softly as I stepped inside. The air was stale and smelled faintly of oil and something metallic. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with dusty cans of food, faded bags of chips, and bottles of soda with labels I didn't recognize. "Hello?" I called out. There was no answer. The counter was empty, but there was a small, old-fashioned bell sitting on it. I rang it, the sharp ding echoing through the store. From the back room, I heard the sound of something heavy scraping against the floor, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. A man emerged, tall and gaunt, with sunken eyes and a face that looked like it hadn't smiled in decades. His clothes were filthy, a stained flannel shirt and torn jeans, and his hands were covered in grease. "Need help?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The pump's not working." He stared at me for a moment, his expression unreadable, before nodding slowly. "I'll turn it on for you." He walked past me, his movements stiff and unnatural, like he was trying to remember how to use his body. I followed him outside, the deck watching as he flipped a switch on the side of the pump. "Should work now," he said, not looking at me. "Thanks," I replied, but he was already walking back inside. I filled up my tank as quickly as I could, glancing nervously at the station. Something about the place felt wrong. The way the shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision, the faint hum in the air that wasn't coming from the pump, it all set my nerves on edge. When I finished, I went back inside to pay. The man was standing behind the counter, his hands resting on the wood. His nails were long and yellow, and his eyes seemed darker than before. "That'll be 25 even," he said, his voice flat. I handed him the cash, and as he counted it, I noticed something on his arm, a long, deep scratch that ran from his wrist to his elbow. The edges were jagged, and it looked fresh, like it had just happened. "Are you okay?" I asked, pointing to the wound. He looked up at me, his expression blank. "Accidents happen." Before I could respond, the lights flickered, and the air in the store seemed to shift. The hum I'd noticed earlier grew louder, vibrating in my chest. "I should get going," I said, backing toward the door. The man didn't say anything, just watched me with those dark, unblinking eyes. As I stepped outside, the lights in the station flickered again, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something in the window. A figure standing behind the man, its face pale and featureless. I hurried to my car and started the engine, but as I pulled away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The man was standing in the doorway, watching me leave. Behind him, the figure was still there, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. I drove as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. The road seemed darker than before, the trees on either side looming like shadows ready to swallow me whole. And then my headlights caught something on the side of the road. A sign. "Last stop gas." I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the pavement. It was the same sign, the same gas station. But that was impossible. I had been driving for at least 15 minutes. There was no way I could have looped back around. My gas gauge was full, so I had no reason to stop. But as I passed the station, I couldn't help but look. The man was still standing in the doorway, but this time he wasn't alone. The pale figure was standing beside him, its hand resting on his shoulder, and they were both staring at me. I pressed down on the accelerator, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't look back. After what felt like an eternity, I saw another sign, a billboard advertising a diner 20 miles ahead. Relief washed over me. I wasn't trapped. I could make it out of this nightmare. But then my car began to sputter. The engine choked and stalled, and I coasted to a stop on the side of the road. My gas gauge was empty. I sat there, staring at the needle in disbelief. My tank had been full. There was no way I could have burned through that much gas in such a short time. And then I saw it. In my rearview mirror, the glowing lights of the gas station appeared in the distance. The sign flickered weakly, and standing beneath it, barely visible in the dim light, was the man. And beside him, the figure. They were closer now, their heads tilted at the same unnatural angle, their eyes fixed on my car. The hum returned, louder this time, vibrating through the air like a swarm of bees. I locked my doors and gripped the wheel, my heart racing. The lights of the gas station flickered again, and when they came back on, The man and the figure were gone. But in the reflection of my rearview mirror, I saw something else, something sitting in the back seat.
Story number 5.
The trip was supposed to be routine, a late-night drive to a remote town for work. I'd been hired to photograph a small property for a real estate listing. It wasn't uncommon for me to travel to out-of-the-way places, but this time, something felt off. The road was dark and desolate, flanked by endless rows of trees that swayed ominously in the wind. Around midnight, my gaslight blinked on. I cursed under my breath. I'd been so focused on reaching the location that I hadn't noticed how low my tank had gotten. I checked my GPS, but there wasn't a gas station in sight. I was about to turn around when a dim glow appeared on the horizon. As I got closer, I saw a decrepit gas station sitting at the end of a dirt road. The sign above it was barely legible, its letters faded and cracked. Something about the place made me uneasy. The lights flickered sporadically, and the air seemed heavier, almost stifling. But I had no choice. I needed gas. I pulled up to one of the pumps and stepped out. The night was unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. I glanced around but didn't see anyone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing. No response. I tried the pump, but it wouldn't start. A small note taped to it read, "Pay inside first." The door to the station creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was damp and smelled faintly of mildew. The shelves were lined with expired snacks and dusty bottles of soda. A single buzzing fluorescent light illuminated the counter. Behind it stood a man. His face was obscured by the shadow of a baseball cap, and he wore a grimy shirt that clung to his gaunt frame. "Need gas?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. "Yes, pump 2, I replied, handing him my card. He took it without a word, swiping it through a machine that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. "Fill it quick," he said, handing the card back. "Don't linger." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. His tone wasn't threatening, but there was something in his eyes, a warning. I hurried back to my car and started pumping the gas. The nozzle creaked as I gripped it, and the sound seemed to echo unnaturally loud in the stillness. Then I felt it, a sensation like someone was watching me. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see the attendant staring at me through the window, but the station was dark. The man was gone. I turned back to the pump, my hands trembling slightly. The numbers ticked up slowly, and I urged it to finish faster. And then I heard it, a faint scraping noise like metal dragging across concrete. It was coming from behind the station. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to get back in the car and drive away. But curiosity got the better of me. I let go of the nozzle and walked toward the sound, my footsteps crunching against the gravel. Behind the station was an old garage, its large metal doors partially open. The scraping noise was louder now, rhythmic and deliberate. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. The noise stopped. For a moment there was only silence, and then a soft whisper, "Leave." I stumbled back, my heart racing. The voice had been so close, yet there was no one there. I turned and sprinted back to my car, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands shook as I grabbed the pump and finished filling the tank. As I placed the nozzle back, I caught a glimpse of something in the station window. A figure. It was tall and pale, its face featureless, except for 2 deep, black pits where its eyes should have been. I blinked, and it was gone. I jumped into my car, started the engine, and peeled out of the station without looking back. The road ahead was dark, but I kept driving, my heart pounding in my chest. After a few miles, I began to calm down. I told myself it had just been my imagination, the result of too little sleep and too much caffeine. But then my headlights caught something ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop just feet from the person. It was the attendant. He stood there, motionless, his cap pulled low over his face. I rolled down my window, my voice trembling. "Are you okay? How did you get here?" He didn't respond. Instead, he slowly raised his hand and pointed behind me. I turned to look in my rearview mirror and felt my blood run cold. The pale figure from the station was standing directly behind my car, its empty eyes locked on me. I whipped around to face the attendant, but he was gone. The figure in the rearview mirror started moving, its jerky, unnatural movements closing the distance between us. I didn't wait to see what would happen. I slammed my foot on the gas and sped down the road, my tires screeching against the pavement. The road twisted and turned, and I didn't slow down until I saw the lights of a small diner up ahead. I pulled into the parking lot, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The diner was bright and bustling, a stark contrast to the eerie silence of the gas station. I stumbled inside, collapsing into a booth. A waitress approached, her brow furrowed in concern. "You okay, hon? You look like you've seen a ghost." I tried to explain what had happened, but the words caught in my throat. "Where did you come from?" she asked. "Just down the road," I managed to say. "The gas station. Last stop gas." Her face paled. "Sweetheart, that station's been closed for years, burned down in a fire back in the 90s. I shook my head. "No, I was just there. I saw the attendant. She cut me off, her voice barely above a whisper. "The man who worked there died in that fire. They say his spirit still lingers, warning people to leave before they see it." "See what?" I asked, my voice trembling. She leaned in closer, her eyes dark. "The thing that caused the fire. It wasn't natural. It feeds on fear, trapping anyone who stays too long." I left the diner without finishing my coffee, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and that cursed gas station. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched.
Story number 6.
It was supposed to be a quick stop, a 5-minute detour to grab gas and snacks before heading back to the interstate. The road stretched long and empty through the heart of nowhere, a black ribbon cutting through endless fields of tall grass. My road trip playlist had long since lost its charm, and I was eager to reach the next town for a proper break. When the glowing gas station sign appeared on the horizon, I felt an odd mix of relief and dread. The station was the only structure for miles, its fluorescent lights buzzing in the oppressive quiet. It looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 1980s, with peeling paint on the walls and a flickering sign that simply read, "Gas." I pulled up to one of the pumps, my headlights illuminating a weathered payphone and a cracked pavement littered with stray weeds. The air was still, thick with an unnatural calm. I stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel underfoot loud in the silence. The pump wouldn't start. A small, handwritten sign taped to it read, "Pay inside first." I grabbed my wallet and headed toward the glass doors. As I pushed them open, the chime of a bell echoed unnaturally loud in the empty store. Inside, the station was dimly lit, the shelves sparsely stocked with faded snacks and dusty cans. A clock above the counter ticked loudly, its hands frozen at 3:17. Behind the counter stood a man, or at least something that resembled a man. His features were slightly off, like a poorly rendered mannequin. His skin was unnervingly smooth, his eyes dull and glassy. He wore a stained uniform with a name tag that read, "Stan." "Pump 2, I said, trying to sound casual. Stan didn't respond. He just stared at me, unblinking. After a moment, he reached for the register and punched in a few buttons, his movements jerky and mechanical. "Anything else?" he asked, his voice flat and monotone. "No, that's it," I said, backing away toward the door. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the convex mirror above the counter. A shadow moved across the back of the store, slipping between the shelves. I spun around, but the aisles were empty. "Everything okay?" Stan asked, his head tilting slightly, almost robotically. I muttered something about needing to hurry and bolted for the door. Back at the pump, I fumbled with the nozzle, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The station loomed behind me, its windows reflecting the flickering lights. That's when I saw it. A figure standing in the far corner of the lot, just beyond the edge of the light. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its face obscured by the shadows. I froze, the nozzle slipping from my hand. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking. No response. I yanked the nozzle from my car, spilling a bit of gas in my haste, and jumped into the driver's seat. The figure was gone. I started the car, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. But as I pulled away, my headlights illuminated something in the rearview mirror. The figure was now standing at the edge of the road, its head cocked to one side, as if curious. I floored the gas pedal, speeding down the empty highway. The station faded into the distance, but my sense of unease only grew stronger. About 10 minutes later, my headlights caught movement ahead. A figure standing in the middle of the road, my stomach dropped. It was the same thing I'd seen at the station. I swerved, narrowly avoiding it, and slammed on the brakes. When I turned to look back, the road was empty. I took a shaky breath and checked my phone for directions. The GPS was glitching, the screen flickering between static and an error message. Route not found. Desperate to get back to civilization, I drove on, the road stretching endlessly before me. But no matter how far I went, the same landmarks kept appearing. A twisted tree, a broken-down car, and eventually, The gas station. I couldn't believe it. I had just driven in a straight line for miles. There was no way I could have circled back. My heart pounded as I pulled into the lot again, this time parking far from the pumps. The station looked exactly as I'd left it, down to the still swaying bell on the door. I didn't want to go back inside, but I had no choice. My gas tank was nearly empty, and my phone had no signal. The door creaked open, the bell chiming once more. "Back so soon?" Stan asked, his monotone voice eerily calm. I didn't respond. My eyes darted to the convex mirror, searching for any sign of the shadow I'd seen earlier. "Lost?" he asked, his lips curling into what might have been a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, can you give me directions?" I stammered. He tilted his head, studying me with that same unnerving stillness. "Sure," he said finally. "Just keep driving. You'll find your way eventually." His words did little to reassure me, but I nodded and hurried back to my car. As I started the engine, I glanced at the rearview mirror out of habit. Stan was standing in the doorway, watching me. But this time, he wasn't alone. The shadowy figure was behind him, its long limbs draped over his shoulders like a grotesque puppet master. Its eyeless face turned toward me, its grin impossibly wide. I slammed the car into reverse, the tires screeching as I peeled out of the lot. My heart raced as I sped down the highway, praying I wouldn't end up back at the station again. For miles, I drove in silence, the oppressive darkness pressing against my windows. And then I saw the lights of a diner up ahead. Relief flooded through me as I pulled into the lot, the warm glow of the neon sign promising safety. I stumbled inside, my legs shaking beneath me. "Long night?" the waitress asked, her voice friendly. "You have no idea," I muttered, sinking into a booth. I didn't bother explaining. Even if I tried, who would believe me? But as I sipped my coffee, I noticed something odd. The waitress was staring at me, her smile frozen and unblinking, and on her uniform a name tag read Stan.
Story number 7.
I had been driving for hours that night, pushing through exhaustion to make it to my parents' house by dawn. The road was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you hyper-aware of every sound. When the fuel gauge dipped dangerously close to empty, I knew I had to stop. The GPS wasn't much help. It marked the nearest gas station as 20 miles back, but I swore I saw a sign not too far ahead. The weathered wooden board had pointed down a narrow road, promising gas just 2 miles off the main highway. Desperate, I took the turn. The road was overgrown and bumpy, flanked by dense trees that seemed to grow darker the deeper I drove. I started to wonder if I'd made a mistake, but before I could turn back, a dim glow appeared ahead. The gas station looked ancient, as though it had been forgotten by time. Its sign flickered faintly, missing a few letters so that it read, "As est Tien." One of the pumps was rusted, the other slightly tilted, and the air smelled of oil and mildew. I parked near the only functioning pump and stepped out of the car, the night air chilling my skin. A lone moth fluttered around the flickering light above the station door. I hesitated, feeling a strange weight settle in my chest. As I walked toward the station to pay, I noticed the windows were caked in grime. I could barely make out the dim interior, but the faint shadow of someone behind the counter reassured me. The door creaked loudly when I opened it, and the smell of stale air hit me like a wave. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed angrily, casting an unsettling yellow glow over the sparse shelves. Behind the counter stood an old man. His skin was pale and waxy, and he barely moved except to shift his glassy eyes in my direction. "Pump 1, I said, sliding a crumpled 20 onto the counter. He didn't respond. "Pump 1, I repeated, louder this time. Finally, he nodded slowly, his head tilting as if it were too heavy for his neck. He grabbed the bill with a skeletal hand and stuffed it into the register, his movements deliberate and jerky. "Anything else?" he rasped. "No, just the gas," I said, already moving toward the door. But just as I reached it, I heard him mutter something. "Careful on the road, Ty. It's not safe out there." I paused, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. His voice had an odd cadence, like he was forcing the words out. "Thanks," I replied, trying to mask my unease as I stepped back into the night. The pump worked fine, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced around, scanning the shadows for movement, but saw nothing. Then, just as I was finishing, I heard a noise. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. I froze, my eyes darting toward the tree line. The sound grew louder, a soft keening that made my stomach twist. Something was out there. I shoved the nozzle back into the pump, my heart pounding as I climbed into the car. I locked the doors and started the engine. But before I could pull away, a figure darted across the edge of my headlights. I slammed on the brakes, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was gone. For a moment, I sat there, paralyzed with fear. Then I shook it off, convincing myself it was just an animal. As I pulled out of the lot, I noticed the old man standing in the doorway of the station, watching me. His face was expressionless, his eyes hollow. I sped down the narrow road, the eerie silence returning as the gas station disappeared in my rearview mirror. But the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. After a few miles, I started to feel like I was being followed. I checked the mirror again, half expecting to see headlights behind me, but the road was empty. Then the car began to sputter. No, I muttered, my grip tightening on the wheel as the engine stalled. I coasted to a stop on the side of the road, my headlights illuminating the dense forest ahead. The air was deathly still. Even the usual hum of insects was absent, leaving only the sound of my labored breathing. I reached for my phone, but it had no signal. My heart sank as I stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting at my skin. I popped the hood, but I wasn't a mechanic. I had no idea what I was looking at. That's when I heard it again. The keening sound, louder this time, closer. I spun around, my eyes straining against the darkness. The trees seemed to shift and sway, their shadows crawling across the road like living things. And then I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the reach of my headlights. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long, its face obscured by a tangle of dark hair. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me. I stumbled back, slamming the hood shut as I scrambled into the car. I locked the doors and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit them into the ignition. The car roared to life, and I floored the gas pedal. The figure didn't follow, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Sure enough, after a few miles, the road began to look familiar. I saw the same twisted tree, the same rusted guardrail, and then the gas station appeared again, its flickering sign casting an eerie glow over the lot. I felt a cold dread wash over me. I didn't want to stop, but my gas gauge was inexplicably empty again. My car sputtered and died just as I rolled into the lot. The old man was still behind the counter, waiting. This time, though, he wasn't alone. Standing next to him, its shadowy form looming over his frail frame, was the figure from the road. Its head turned toward me, and though I couldn't see its eyes, I knew it was smiling.
Story number 8.
I was driving home late one night after visiting my sister in a town 2 hours away. The highway stretched endlessly ahead of me, and the few cars I'd seen earlier had vanished, leaving me alone under the dim glow of my headlights. The low fuel light blinked on, snapping me out of my exhaustion. I cursed myself for not filling up earlier, scanning the horizon for any sign of a gas station. Just as I was starting to panic, a neon sign flickered into view. A solitary gas station in the middle of nowhere. I pulled in, relieved. The place looked old, the kind of station that hadn't seen an upgrade since the 80s. The pumps were manual, the building small and nondescript, with a single bulb illuminating the lot. As I got out to pump gas, I noticed the silence. No insects, no distant hum of cars, just the faint whir of the pump. It felt unnatural. When the pump clicked off, I headed inside to pay. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and a bell jingled overhead. Inside, the air was stale and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. The shelves were sparsely stocked. Chips that looked expired, faded candy wrappers, and a few dusty bottles of soda. Behind the counter sat a man in his late 60s. He wore a plaid shirt, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken into dark sockets. "Evening," he rasped without looking up. "Hi, pump 2, I said, handing over a 20. He took the money, his movements slow and deliberate. As he rang me up, I glanced around the store. Something about it felt off. That's when I noticed a door at the back of the store. It was slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. "Need anything else?" the man asked, startling me. "No, just the gas," I said quickly. "All right." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You should be careful out there. Strange things happen on this stretch of road." I forced a chuckle. "Yeah, thanks." As I turned to leave, the bell jingled again, but I hadn't opened the door. I froze. The clerk didn't react, his expression unchanged as he stared past me, toward the door at the back of the store. "Forget something?" he asked, his tone casual, though his eyes were now fixed on the shadows behind me. I turned slowly, but nothing was there, just the shelves and the dimly lit store. "No, I'm good," I muttered, walking out as fast as I could without breaking into a run. Back in the car, I locked the doors and started the engine. My hands were shaking, and I told myself it was just my imagination. But as I pulled out of the lot, I couldn't help glancing in the rearview mirror. The gas station looked smaller, darker, almost like it was fading into the night. I tried to focus on the road, but something felt wrong. The highway ahead looked unfamiliar, even though I'd driven this route dozens of times. The trees seemed to crowd closer to the road, their branches stretching like skeletal fingers. After about 10 minutes, I saw lights in the distance. Relief washed over me. Another gas station. Maybe I'd taken a wrong turn without realizing it. I pulled in, but as I approached the pumps, dread settled in my chest. It was the same station. The same flickering neon sign, the same tilted pump, the same dim bulb casting eerie shadows over the lot. No, I whispered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. I didn't want to stop, but my gas gauge was inexplicably empty again. I cursed under my breath, pulling into the lot. This time I didn't go inside. I used my credit card at the pump, avoiding the building entirely. As I pumped the gas, I felt it again, that suffocating silence. And then, a sound, a faint scraping like nails dragging across metal. I turned my head slowly, the hairs on my arms standing on end. Behind the station, in the shadows just beyond the light, something moved. It was subtle at first, like a trick of the eye, but then I saw it clearly, a figure, hunched and twisted, its movements jerky and unnatural. It stepped into the light, and I felt my stomach drop. The thing was impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and thin. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its face was blank, featureless, except for a wide, crooked smile. I froze, unable to breathe as it took a step closer. The pump clicked off, breaking the spell. I yanked the nozzle out and jumped into the car, slamming the door shut. The figure was gone. My hands fumbled with the keys as I started the engine, the sound of my heartbeat roaring in my ears. As I sped out of the lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it chasing me. Instead, I saw the clerk. He was standing in the doorway, watching me leave. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, in the darkness of the store, I saw multiple sets of glowing eyes. I didn't stop driving until I reached my parents' house. When I told them what happened, they looked at me like I was crazy. My dad even pulled up Google Maps to show me the area. There was no gas station on that stretch of road.
Story number 9.
It was nearing midnight when I realized I needed gas. I had been driving for hours on a lonely highway, the kind where the radio crackles into static and the only light comes from your high beams. My destination was still a couple of hours away, and I didn't want to risk running out of fuel in the middle of nowhere. When the glowing gas ahead sign appeared, I let out a sigh of relief. The exit led to a narrow, unlit road that twisted into the woods, and for a moment, I debated turning back. But the needle on my gas gauge was dangerously close to empty. The gas station came into view, shrouded in mist. It looked ancient, with peeling paint on the walls and a weathered sign that simply read, "Gas." A single flickering light hung above the pumps, barely cutting through the darkness. I pulled up to one of the pumps and stepped out. The air was cold and smelled faintly of damp earth and motor oil. As I unscrewed the gas cap, I noticed the station was eerily quiet. No hum of insects, no rustle of wind through the trees, just silence. I tried the pump, but nothing happened. A worn-out note taped to the side read, "Pay inside first." Reluctantly, I headed for the small building. The glass door creaked as I pushed it open, and a bell jingled overhead. Inside, the smell hit me, stale air and something faintly metallic like rust or blood. The store was dimly lit, with shelves lined with dusty cans and outdated snacks. Behind the counter sat a man who looked as worn as the station itself. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and he wore a grease-stained uniform that seemed too large for his thin frame. "Pump one," I said, trying to sound casual as I handed him my card. He stared at me for a moment, his sunken eyes unblinking, before taking it. His hands were rough, his nails dark with grime. "Fill it up," he muttered in a voice that was barely audible. As I turned to leave, I noticed something odd. On the wall behind him hung a large yellowed map of the area. Red pins were scattered across it, clustered in random spots. "Everything okay?" I asked, my voice betraying my unease. The man didn't respond, just handed my card back and nodded toward the door. I hurried back to the pump, wanting to be done with this place as quickly as possible. As the gas flowed, I kept glancing toward the woods surrounding the station. The trees were unnaturally still, their shadows stretching unnervingly long under the faint glow of the station's light. Then I heard it, a faint sound, like a soft shuffling coming from the woods. I froze, straining to hear. It came again, closer this time, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. My heart raced as I scanned the darkness, but I couldn't see anything beyond the faint glow of the station. I told myself it was just my imagination, fueled by exhaustion and the eerie setting. The pump clicked off, and I hurried to replace the nozzle. Just as I climbed back into the car, a loud thud echoed from the roof. I screamed, my hands gripping the wheel as I ducked instinctively. Another thud followed, then a scraping sound like nails dragging across metal. I dared to look up through the windshield. A pair of glowing eyes stared back at me. The creature perched on my roof was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Its body was thin and wiry, its skin a sickly gray that seemed to shimmer in the light. Its face was elongated, with sharp, jagged teeth that curled into a grotesque grin. It tilted its head, watching me with an almost curious expression, before slamming its clawed hands against the windshield. The glass cracked under the force, and I snapped out of my paralysis. Throwing the car into reverse, I hit the gas. The creature slid off the roof as the car lurched backward. Without thinking, I shifted into drive and sped toward the exit. In the rearview mirror, I saw it rise to its feet, its glowing eyes locked onto my car as it began to chase me. It moved unnaturally fast, its limbs contorting in ways that didn't seem possible. My heart pounded as I floored the accelerator, the trees blurring past me. The creature was gaining on me, its grin widening as it closed the distance. Just when I thought it was about to catch me, the headlights of an approaching truck illuminated the road ahead. The creature let out an ear-piercing screech and darted into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. The truck slowed as it passed me, the driver giving me a concerned look. I didn't stop to explain, too terrified to do anything but keep driving. When I finally reached a populated area, I pulled into a brightly lit parking lot and sat there, trembling. The scratches on my roof and the cracked windshield were the only evidence of what had happened. Later, I tried to look up the gas station, but no matter how hard I searched, I couldn't find any record of it.
Story number 10.
I was on the tail end of a long drive home, the kind where your eyes burn from staring at the road for too long and your body aches from sitting. The highway was empty, stretching endlessly under the pale glow of the moon. A low fuel warning chimed on my dashboard, and I cursed under my breath. The next exit sign promised a gas station a mile ahead. Relieved, I took it, following a narrow, cracked road lined with nothing but dark woods on either side. The gas station appeared like something out of an old horror movie, dilapidated, dimly lit, and seemingly abandoned. The sign hanging above read Everlast Gas in flickering neon letters, some of the bulbs burnt out. I pulled up to the only pump, which looked just as ancient as the rest of the place. The screen was blank and the nozzle hung limply, almost as if it hadn't been used in years. A handwritten sign taped to the pump read, "Pay inside." I sighed and stepped out into the cold night air. The stillness unnerved me. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence so deep it pressed against my ears. The station's glass door was fogged up and the fluorescent lights inside flickered sporadically. I pushed the door open, a bell jangling overhead. Inside, the place was a relic of another era. The shelves were stocked with faded bags of chips, dusty bottles of soda, and cans of food that looked decades old. A faint, musty smell hung in the air. Behind the counter stood a man who looked just as ancient as the station. His skin was pale, almost waxy, and his eyes had a dull, glassy quality. He wore a greasy uniform and didn't acknowledge me when I approached. "Pump one," I said, sliding a $20 bill across the counter. He stared at the bill for a moment, then at me, his lips curling into a strange smile. "You sure you want to be out here this late?" I forced a chuckle. "No choice. Long drive." He didn't respond, just rang me up and handed me my change. His hands were cold when they brushed against mine, colder than they should have been. As I turned to leave, he added, almost as an afterthought, "Don't go wandering. Not everything out there likes being found." I paused, unsure how to respond, then nodded and walked out. Back at the pump, I inserted the nozzle and waited for the gas to flow. As I stood there, I glanced around. The station's single floodlight barely lit the lot, and beyond it, the woods loomed like a black wall. Then I heard it, a faint rustling coming from the trees. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound grew louder, closer. I squinted into the darkness, but the light didn't reach far enough to see anything. Suddenly, the rustling stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl. I froze, my heart pounding. The growl came again, deeper this time, and it was clear it wasn't an animal. I yanked the nozzle from my car, not caring if I had a full tank, and jumped back into the driver's seat. As I started the engine, the growl turned into a series of sharp, guttural clicks. It sounded wrong, unnatural. I glanced in my rearview mirror, and there it was. A figure stood at the edge of the woods just beyond the light. It was tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs that bent at odd angles. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes glowed faintly in the dark. It tilted its head, as if studying me, before taking a slow, deliberate step forward. I slammed the car into reverse, the tires screeching as I backed away from the pump. The creature moved faster now, its jerky, unnatural movements sending a chill down my spine. I threw the car into drive and sped toward the exit. But as I approached the narrow road, I saw it. Another figure standing in the middle of the path. This one was smaller, but just as grotesque, with the same glowing eyes and twisted limbs. It let out a shrill, piercing scream that made my ears ring and my chest ache. I swerved onto the shoulder, barely avoiding the thing, and sped back toward the highway. The road twisted and turned, the trees crowding closer as if trying to swallow me. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. In the rearview mirror, I saw them, multiple figures darting between the trees, keeping pace with my car. My mind raced. I couldn't go back to the gas station, and the highway was still miles away. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a light up ahead. Desperate, I headed for it, hoping it was another gas station or a house, anywhere I could find help. The light grew brighter, and soon I realized it was another car parked on the side of the road, its hazards flashing. I pulled up behind it and jumped out, yelling for help. The car was empty, the driver's side door hanging open. The interior light revealed a scattering of belongings, a wallet, a phone, a cup of coffee still steaming. The air around me felt wrong, heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest. Then I heard it again, the clicking sounds, coming from all directions now. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. They were everywhere. The creatures emerged from the trees, their twisted forms illuminated by my headlights. I stumbled back into my car, slamming the door shut and locking it. As I started the engine, one of them leapt onto the hood, its clawed hands scraping against the windshield. Its glowing eyes locked onto mine, and it let out that horrible scream again. I floored the gas pedal, the car lurching forward. The creature flew off the hood, and I didn't stop to see if it got back up. The highway finally came into view, and as I merged onto it, the creatures disappeared. I drove for miles without stopping, my heart pounding and my mind racing. When I finally reached a town, I pulled into a brightly lit diner and sat in the parking lot, trying to calm down. I wanted to call someone, report what I'd seen, but what could I say? That I'd been chased by creatures straight out of a nightmare. The next day, I tried to find the gas station on a map, but it wasn't there.